Welcome to DT Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. I'm DT Kane, author of the epic fantasy series The Aggresfar Saga and the spoken books Uprising. Each week, I read from one of my novels, discuss my writing process, answer your questions, and have general discussions about fantasy fiction. It's like a book club, except I do all the work for you. Find show notes, info about all my novels, and much more at dtkane.com. Here's the show. All right, listeners, welcome back to DT Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. Today is April 2nd, 2023, as I record this, which is episode 32 of Season 2 of the podcast and episode 59 overall. We will be picking up here on the second half of Chapter 35 of Declaimer's Discovery. You'll recall last week that we switched perspectives to Deliritous. He just arrived in Fortune 7 days after we left Baz, who was apparently captured by Farston after he broke into Liamina Library. Deliritous is in the reading district in Fortune, and he just turned away from the execution of a speaker by the torture wheel, and he's just seen a man in a curiously colorful robe, and you may recall that there was a man in a curiously colorful robe in the prologue of this novel. You can go back and re-listen to the prologue in episode 1 of season 2 if you need a refresher, but otherwise, let's jump right back in here. If you're following along in the print book, this is page 323 of the paperback edition of Declaimer's Discovery. You don't look like you're from around here, son. Son? Del frowned at the man, putting a hand to his head to make sure he was wearing his hat. And erstwhile there was many a reader who'd order a man whipped for addressing him so, but Del supposed making a scene would do nothing to help him. Besides, the man was likely just a middling merchant who didn't know any better. His robe wasn't that nice up close, though it outshone the dingy riding jacket Del still sported. "Greetings," Del said, giving the man a short bow. "What makes you say that?" The stranger chuckled. "Well, you're about as white as those conservators' robes, for starters." Del scowled. "Do you mean to imply, sir, that if I was from Fortune I'd be accustomed to such gratuitous displays of cruelty? They're not even trying to extract information from him." The man in the colored robe raised an eyebrow. Del cleared his throat, realizing he'd just criticized the punishment being exacted upon a speaker who'd been found guilty of sedition. Rather than take issue with the statement, though, the stranger ceased his chuckling, expression growing somber, not unlike how he'd looked before noticing Del. "In my experience, son, there aren't many in oration who'd speak so. It is refreshing." "Oh," Del said, looking down at his boots. "Well, my father says I often open my mouth before I ought to, so my apologies if I offended. But where are my manners?" Del raised his eyes to look the stranger in the face. "I am Deliritous Acktus Torchsire, Marquis and heir to Torchsire Library in erstwhile, and that city's representative at the upcoming Triumvirate Congress." The man's brows rose again. Then he gave Del a much deeper bow than Del had given him. "Pardon me, Marquis. I'd not have addressed you so informally if I'd known. It's just, I'm unaccustomed to seeing men of your stature out in public without a speaker in tow." Whatever minor lifting of Del's spirits the man's bow had caused was immediately nixed and then some. The man's tone also wasn't nearly as respectful as the depth of his bow might have otherwise implied it would be. There was something lyrical in his words, almost as if he was suppressing a chuckle. Yes, well, we ran into some unfortunate circumstances during our travels here, Del said curtly, nodding backward to indicate rocks. He could now feel the large man hovering right over his shoulder, as he always did when Del interacted with any other person who drew breath. Ah, an enigman. The robed man gave Rox a bow surprisingly similar to the one he'd given Del. If Rox's size intimidated him, it didn't show on the man's face. "How go things in the Verity Mountains?" the robed man asked. The Verity Mountains? What was the man talking about? Del had never heard of such a place. Clearly, there was something off with this chap. "The Verity Mountains," Rox repeated. "I have not heard that name in a very long time." Del looked over his shoulder to the harbor. Rox's brows were drawn down as if in confusion. He looked back to the man in the colored robe. "You'll have to forgive me," the stranger said, bowing again. "An old term for enigma I once heard. That's all I meant." "Oh," Del said, giving a nervous laugh. The man was obviously deluded. "Well, I'm afraid Rox won't be able to give you any news from there. He hasn't been to Enigma since I was born." Oh yes, I keep forgetting. The masks. He's your Harbour, then?" "Yes," Del said slowly. What sort of man didn't know what a Harbour's mask meant? For that matter, what sort of man addressed a Harbour so directly, and so casually? "I apologize," Del said, "but we really must be going. Preparations for the Congress and all. I'm sure you understand, my good man." "Certainly," the robed man said, though he held a hand out to forestall Del's immediate departure, the linked rings on his fingers jingling like a feast day ensemble. "But at least allow me to introduce myself. I'm Stephan of Gahlfet Library." It was Del's turn to raise an eyebrow. "Oh, you're a Gahlfet reader, then? Forgive me, it's just you're not wearing a hat." "No offense taken. Besides, I'm not exactly a Gahlfet reader anyway." I thought you said you're from Gahlfet Library." "I did. I am employed by the library, but not a member of the family." "Ah, but you can read?" The gracious expression Stephan's face had taken on turned to one of mild irritation. "Of course I can read." Del held his hands out in a calming gesture. Of course. It's just, you must do things differently here in Fortune than I'm accustomed to in erstwhile. There, if you're a reader, it means you're a family member in one of the 9 libraries." "Yes," Stephan said, his face snapping back to one of accommodating civility. "That's how it's done here as well, but suffice it to say, I'm a bit of a special case. In fact, I'm currently the steward of Gahlfet Library." "The steward?" Del felt his face heat and immediately bent into a deep bow, sweeping his hat off so that its feather brushed over the cobbles. That was an uncommon title, only given during interim periods where a library was mourning the loss of its duke or duchess, but the new one had not yet been appointed. During that period, the steward held all the powers of a duke, which meant this man actually outranked him. "My humblest apologies, sir. If I'd known—" No matter, Stephan said, pushing Del's formality away like a man might a serving of overdone peas. "I'm not exactly dressed as a steward, and I don't even have a Harbour with me, much less a speaker. I'd fail my own test for what a reader ought to look like." Well, Del couldn't disagree with that. The man looked about as far from a reader as a squirrel did from a fox. Not that he intended to express such a thought aloud. "Torchsire, did you say?" Stephan asked, face pensive. "Didn't they just win erstwhile's trials?" Dell's cheeks flamed, and he prayed Stephan just took it as the embarrassment of a humble man, rather than the shame of a fraud. "Indeed, sir, I was victorious just a few months back." "Oh, very good. I'd heard rumors that your speaker is rather gifted." The man smiled as if he meant something more than he was saying aloud. Dell glanced to Rox. One less familiar with the Harbour likely would have seen no change in the giant man's demeanor, but Rox's hand had crept just a bit closer to the hilt of his razor. Dell gave a subtle shake of his head. It had to just be the man's peculiar way of speaking. He couldn't possibly know about Bastion. Dell turned back to Stephan, laughing, but keeping his words guarded. "Bastion certainly was different, if that's what you mean." "Was?" Stephan asked. Dell tried to keep his tone casual, but found to his dismay that the words left his tongue with a distinct bitterness. His father really was right. His mouth would be the death of him one day. "He was lost on our way here. We were attacked off the shores of the Shallows by a band of cityless. Bastion, my speaker, was taken along with the conservator who was intended to represent erstwhile's conservatory at the Congress." Stephan's expression dropped to one of seemingly genuine disappointment. "Ah, a true shame. I myself have had a fair share of heartache revolving around speakers as of late." Dell could have smacked himself in the forehead. Of course! This man was from Gahlfet Library, where the Uprising had taken place. "Please, permit me to offer my condolences to your entire library," Dell said. "We may be separated by leagues and leagues, but Torchsire stands in solidarity with you to ensure such a tragedy is not repeated." "Yes, thank you," Stephan said, though his tone was distracted, looking over Dell's shoulder. His expression had returned to one of distaste. Dell followed Stephan's gaze just in time to witness the massive warden roll the wheel over the speaker's midsection. It was probably just his imagination, but Dell was certain he heard the poor wretch's ribs snap. Either the speaker had shouted himself hoarse, or the wheel had driven the air from his lungs, for while he was weeping and shaking in his bonds, little sound was now escaping his lips. Dell shuddered and turned back to Stephan. "For one apparently so accustomed to such displays," Dell said, "you appear awfully sullen. Why aren't you cheering along with the rest of the crowd?" Stephan refocused on Dell, a grim smile upturning his lips, though the frown remained reflected in his eyes. "That is a Gahlfet speaker. It's due to my failure that he's found himself in that unfortunate position." "Your failure?" Dell asked, unable to keep the flabbergast from his voice. "Certainly you didn't encourage him to sedition." "No, of course not," Stephan snapped, almost too quickly. He took a long breath. "But when you take from a man his freedom, you assume the responsibility for his actions, and for teaching him what he can and cannot do." Dell scoffed. "Don't be so hard on yourself. Most speakers wouldn't know what was good for them if it was handed to them on a tray. We can only do so much. If they act out, it certainly isn't our fault. You can always buy another." Stephan remained silent for a time, his eyes drifting back to the scene over Dell's shoulder. Another thud of the wheel signaled the breaking of another of the speaker's limbs. Dell didn't turn to look, and Stephan gave no indication of upset other than the thin-lipped expression he already wore. Finally, his stare returned to Dell. "So, in your view, speakers do have freedom, then?" "What? No, of course not. They're our property. They're no more free than—" Dell looked about for an apt comparison. "Well, no more free than our boots, I suppose. I put them on each morning. They go wherever I wish, serve at my whims." Stephan raised a finger to his lips as if in deep thought. "Yet you believe speakers are accountable for their own actions? Well, of course, they chose them. Ah. Stephan now waved that same finger beneath Dell's nose. But do they? If they've no freedom, can they exercise free will? Dell laughed, though not from amusement. Of course they have free will. They can choose to disregard any command they please. Their minds are their own. You sound like an enigma, Steward Stephan. Stephan responded with a laugh of his own, though, unlike Dell's, his held a definitive note of amusement. What do you think, Harbour? Stephan asked. There he went again, attempting to draw Rox into a conversation. What a strange man. A decision to act, Rox said, speaking slowly, as he often did when he was being certain not to speak an untruth, is not freely made if the only alternative offered is death. Dell waved a hand in the air. Oh, you'll never get a straight answer from him. Talking to Rox is like conversing with a puzzle. Some of life's most interesting discussions are puzzles, Marquis Deliritous, Stephan responded. Let me ask you this. Is it your boot's fault if its sole separates from the welt, or its leather cracks, or the laces snap? Dell rolled his eyes. Of course not, and none of those things would happen to a well-cared-for pair of boots. It's the owner's fault if any of those things happen to... Dell scowled, realizing what Stephan had done. You're talking in circles, steward. That's not the same thing as a speaker at all. Stephan raised his hands defensively. It was your analogy, Marquis, not mine. I meant no offense, just to engage in some friendly philosophy. But might I suggest you think on that? On what? Stephan smiled. Why, whether or not it makes sense to view a speaker the same as you do inanimate chattel. If your reaction to the breaking of a man with the wheel is any indication, you have a reasonable head on your shoulders. I think you'll find, if you think on it enough, you'll find it to be an inapt comparison. And once you reach that conclusion, well, if you ever find yourself reaching that conclusion, call on me, and we can continue this banter. But for now, I'm afraid I must be going. Stephan's eyes darted over Dell's other shoulder, away from the grisly execution. Dell followed Stephan's gaze and saw 2 lines of 5 men each, all of them dressed in matching uniforms of dark green, pressed so crisply their folds appeared sharp enough to cut steel. The 3 trees of the Creator, Liamina Fortune, was stitched in yellow thread across their jacket breasts, the trunk of the center tree bisected by shining buttons. Each man was dark-skinned, tanned by Fortune's sun, and a long sword in a golden scabbard at his hip. They all wore dark facial hair, trimmed with such precision you could have used the edges to level a table. Dell looked back to Stephan to ask who the soldiers were, but the man in the colored robe was gone. Dell had only looked away for a moment, but Stephan was nowhere to be seen, which seemed impossible. Even if he'd turned and run, Dell should have been able to see that robe of his from a mile away. Dell rose up on his tiptoes, thinking perhaps his view was just being blocked by some of the taller folks still gathered to watch the execution. Marquis Deliritous Torchsire? Asked an official-sounding voice from behind Dell. He turned to find the soldiers stopped directly in front of him. There was an 11th man with them whom Dell hadn't noticed before. He wore the same uniform as the others, though a number of medals in a variety of colors, some encrusted with gemstones, hung from his jacket, though that was hardly notable considering the man's face, or lack thereof. He wore a bronze mask, sculpted to resemble a man's face, complete with engraved curly hair, openings for the eyes, and a thin slit at the lips. The openings were deep enough that Dell could not see any features of the face hidden within. A single tear was depicted falling from one of the mask's eyes. Dell gulped. He He'd heard stories of this man, for there was no mistaking who he was. "I am Deliritous Torchsire," Del responded, shamed at how much his voice shook. The soldier standing beside the masked man, apparently the one who'd addressed Del before he turned, spoke again. "By order of General Hedin Vanjo, Supreme Commander of the Indomitable Army, we are to take your property into custody." "My property?" "Yes." The soldier pointed a finger over Del's shoulder. "The Harbour. He is to be detained." Hello, DT crew. Once more, welcome back to DT Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. Hope you enjoyed the rest of Chapter 35 of Declaimer's Discovery. Interesting. Do we have you put together who this man in a many-colored robe is? Like I said at the beginning, we saw him in the prologue, but we have also seen a man in an oddly colorful robe before. Think back to the prologue of Book 1, the Acktus Trials, or if you have read the bonus epilogue to the Acktus Trials, he also appears there. If you head over to my website, dtkane.com, you can sign up for my email list or sign up for it again, even if you're already on there, to get that bonus epilogue to Book 1, if you haven't read that already. But yes, so he keeps popping up here, right? So you gotta think he's going to be important at some point. And then Del seems to be in a bit of trouble here. What did the soldiers of the Indomitable Army want with rocks? And who is this man in the bronze mask? Presumably he is Hedin Vanjo, who the captain mentioned there at the end. "By order of General Hedin Vanjo, we are to take your property into custody." And you may recall that name has briefly come up in conversation before. Ag, who is Duke Farston's Harbour, was trained by the sword master Hedin Vanjo. So this guy knows how to use a weapon. So going to be interesting to see what happens with that next week when Dale continues to talk to them and see what they want with rocks. So next episode we will be reading Chapter 36 of Declaimer's Discovery, and we will see what happens with that. Quick personal update here. I am working away on Book 6 of the Spoken Books Uprising currently. Probably going to be titled Fire and Ink. Haven't 100% settled on that, but that's the title I've put on the draft thus far. Unless I have a serious change of heart, that's probably what I'm going to be sticking with. About 65,000 words into the draft, but I have paused drafting new stuff. I'm kind of breaking my general rule of flying through the first draft. I'm going back and editing a few things just because I've discovered enough plot twists and some modified character motivations that I just felt like I needed to go back and rewrite a few scenes and chapters. I'm almost complete with that now, though, so I'll be plowing on with the draft. This is looking like it's going to be a longer entry in the series here, because, like I said, I'm at 65,000 words, and I don't think I'm anywhere close to done. So I'm not even sure I'm halfway through yet. So, 65,000 times 2, that's 130. If I'm not halfway done yet, what are we looking at, 150 plus? That would be the longest book in the series thus far if it actually reaches those heights of word count. So we'll see. Declaimer's Discovery, actually the book we're reading now, Declaimer's Discovery, is around 140,000 words, and that's currently the longest installment. So we shall see. But I'm still grinding away. It's tough. You'd think after writing half a dozen novels, it would maybe get a little easier drafting the first the first installment of, or not the first installment, but writing the first draft. But that's, at least it's not my experience. You know, each story seems to have its unique issues that you have to iron out, and, you know, the self-doubt never fully goes away, especially when you don't have a completed manuscript yet. You worry that, you know, this is the time that you're just going to completely implode and not be able to finish it. But I guess the one benefit of having done this 6 times before is at least I'm prepared for this mild writing depression to set in when I'm about halfway through a draft. So I know I just have to keep writing and pushing on, and you know, I'll have a finished draft before long. So trying to keep my chin up and keep working on it. And like I said, I'm already feeling better about it. You know, the past couple weeks I've been a little down on my writing, but feeling a little more optimistic today. Let's see. Other than that, like I said in the newsletter, next week is my birthday, so there will be no newsletter next week, and I may not do a podcast episode next week either. I know that'll disappoint many of you out there, but I'm going to be traveling again next weekend, and I just don't want to. I don't want to overcommit to you guys out there, but if I don't release one next week, definitely the following week we'll be back with an episode. So we'll see. Hang in there. I know I've been a little inconsistent releasing here the past couple months. It's just been a busy time over here in the Kane household. To tide you over, though, if you aren't a newsletter subscriber, I am currently offering a special freebie here. I'm trying to build up some more reviews, particularly on Amazon, of my box set of the Spoken Books Uprising, which has the first 3 books in it. So if you are interested in receiving a electronic copy of that box set, email me, dtkane@dtkane.com, and I will give you one free of charge. The only thing I ask in return is that you leave a review of it on Amazon and wherever else you leave reviews of books, like Goodreads or other e-commerce sites. You know, I harp on Amazon reviews a lot, and I know some people don't really care for Amazon, but the fact of the matter is, you know, that's where the majority of my business still comes from. I mean, I do sell wide across all platforms because I think it's important to offer it wherever people buy books. But, you know, especially when it comes to promotions and stuff, it's Amazon that promoters look to see how many reviews it has there. So the reviews on Amazon do, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your view on things, carry a greater weight than necessarily reviews elsewhere. So that's the only reason I say that. But a review anywhere is definitely much appreciated. But like I said, you can email me, dtkane@dtkane.com. If you're listening to this in the next, 2 weeks, it's April 2nd, 2023 right now. You know, if you are listening to this way in the future, don't email me for a free box set, because this is a limited time offer. But do remember, in addition to the 3 books, there are also 2 original essays in that box set, written by me about my inspirations for the series. And there's also character art depicting Baz, Rox, and Deliritous. So if you are interested, even if you've read the first 3 books already and you're interested in reading those essays and seeing that character art, it is worth your time. So feel free to email me about that. Okay, so then we've just got our fantasy quote of the week here. This week's comes from Jim Butcher and Death Masks, which is one of the novels in his Dresden Files series. Life would be unbearably dull if we had answers to all our questions. So I was browsing Goodreads for this week's quote of the week, and as I said in the newsletter, sorry if that spoils the fantasy some of you may have had of me sitting in an easy chair thumbing through physical books each Thursday night, searching for my quote of the week. I'm usually just doing Google searches, which usually lead me to Goodreads to find quotes. But I stopped on this one because it made me think of a couple valuable lessons, I think. I also stopped on it because I've recently been continuing my read-through of the Dresden Files series. I'm currently on Cold Days, which is book 14 in the series. There's currently 17 of them out, so I'm nearly caught up with the series. If you've ever, or if you've never listened to the Dresden audiobooks, you should do yourself a favor and go download Stormfront right now, which is that's book 1 in the series. They are narrated by James Marsters, who played Spike in the Buffy the Vampire Slayer TV show. Though you do not have to be a Buffy the Vampire Slayer fan to enjoy his narration or the Dresden Files, but he is an excellent narrator. I would say he's probably right up there with Tim Curry and Michael Kramer and Kate Redding as some of my favorite audiobook narrators. But anyway, back to the quote. Again, life would be unbearably dull if we had answers to all our questions. I think we all sometimes get too preoccupied with answers. That's what this quote made me think of. For instance, I'm not sure I know how, so I just won't try. Or, why did he do that? Or, what will happen if I make this change? The search for answers can sometimes become paralyzing, and the fact is, sometimes an answer isn't readily available, or there isn't just one answer. Should you change your job? There are pros and cons. Is it wise to tackle a new project at work, even though you aren't sure you can do it? Well, it's a risk, but you couldn't press your boss. Why did that guy snap at you yesterday? Well, I don't know. Maybe his mom just died, or maybe he's just an asshole. I'm not suggesting we shouldn't think critically and weigh what we know, but we must also accept that there will always be more information to gather, always more time to think. Consider carefully, but then act with conviction. Will things always go right? Of course not. But a life of action is better than a life of regretting your inaction. This quote also made me think of a related item, which is the news. I don't know. I cringe when I hear about the news, frankly. There's a lot of bad that goes on in the world, and the news shoves it into our faces because it's the ugly and shocking that sells papers or online advertisements. And unfortunately, not the pleasant and heartwarming things that are going on out there. I know people who agonize over all of the tragic headlines. But ask yourself, how much value do you actually get from the news you consume? There's little you can do about most of it, and for the truly evil things that are so often reported, there's no use obsessing over how someone could have done such a thing, because there's often no good answer. See above. Now, I don't advocate ignoring the news completely, but as with most things, I think it's best consumed in moderation. Read the headlines, scan a few articles, if you must, but when your blood pressure begins to rise, put down the paper or your smartphone and go read a novel instead. It'll make both you and authors everywhere happier. All right, that's my latest entry into the quote of the week, where I try to apply passages from fantasy novels to real life and real life lessons. And as always, if you have a favorite fantasy quote you think would be a good addition to a future installment of Fantasy Quote of the Week, email me, dtkane@dtkane.com, and I may very well share it in a future newsletter and podcast. Also, just a quick reminder to check out this week's newsletter for some photos of my trip to New York City. Got a few good ones in there. And I'm also renting a new camera for my birthday this week, so when the newsletter returns in 2 weeks, I hope to have lots of good photos to share with you then as well. And if you aren't a newsletter subscriber, you can head over to dtkane.com/email-signup, and you can sign up for the newsletter. Or you can just go to dtkane.com, and the newsletter sign-up is pretty prominently displayed there on the right-hand side of the screen. So that is all for this week. So until next time, this has been D.T. Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. Thanks for listening to D.T. Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. If you liked today's episode, please consider rating and reviewing wherever you listen to podcasts. If you're watching on YouTube, give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and hit that subscribe button and the bell so you get notified whenever new episodes become available. If you'd like to listen to back episodes or review the show notes, visit dtkane.com/podcast. D.T. Kane's novels are available for purchase at most major online retailers, or you can purchase directly from his website at www.dtkane.com/books. You can receive a free short story and sign up for D.T. Kane's mailing list at dtkane.com/email-signup. If you'd like to connect, you can find D.T. Kane on Facebook at D.T. Kane Author or Twitter at D.T. Kane Author, or send D.T. Kane an email at dtkane@dtkane.com. See you next week.